Hello there, this is Brennan Marr, host of Page Turners They Were Not, a Star Wars podcast. And I'm here to tell you about Anchor. Anchor is the best way to make a podcast. Why is that? Well, first off, it's free. Yes, you heard me right. Anchor is free. Anchor has all the tools you need to make a podcast from your phone or your computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you on various platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can make money from your podcast. And get this, with no minimum listenership. That means you can make money even if no one listens to your podcast. That, of course, is not ideal, as Anchor will allow you to spread your podcast, bring in more viewers, and you can make more money because of it. Everything you need to make a podcast is in one place on Anchor. If you're interested, download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Thank you, and may the Force be with you. Hello, everyone. My name is Brendan Marr. That noise you're hearing is my ventilator. And welcome to Page Turners They Were Not, my Star Wars podcast. Today's Thursday, so we are going to continue celebrating the classic cinema that connects to Star Wars. Last week we did The Great Casablanca, one of the most iconic films in American history. Today, we will also be dealing with an iconic film in the great history of the Golden Age of Hollywood. And that is John Ford's classic 1939 Western, Stagecoach. John Ford, my friends, is one of the greatest directors this country has ever seen. John Ford was an auteur before the days of auteur cinema. Now, what is an auteur? An auteur is a director who is the author of their film. I don't mean that they necessarily write the movie, though some auteurs do. But it is their movie, through and through. Now, the reason I mentioned that John Ford is an auteur before auteurs is that the concept of auteur cinema in America did not really become a big deal till what is called New Hollywood, spanning from the late 60s to the early 80s. In the golden age of Hollywood, movies were very much controlled by the studio system. And creative expression from the directors was tempered and reined in, and they were not allowed, or at least not given, as much freedom to roam with their artistic vision. John Ford is one of the few exceptions, along with people like Orson Welles and Frank Capra and Charlie Chaplin. Ford was able to make his films uniquely his own. Now, to be clear, the auteur theory of cinema is just that, a theory. It is not agreed upon by everyone. But for me personally, I do agree with the theory, and I do think John Ford was one of the great auteurs. Stagecoach is also the film that introduced the world to John Wayne. Now, John Wayne had been in many, many movies prior to this, but Stagecoach made him a movie star. So, what is the story of Stagecoach? Well, it's about a stagecoach. In 1880, a group of strangers board a stagecoach going from the Arizona Territory to Lordsburg, New Mexico. And they are a strange cast of characters, for sure. You have Dallas, a prostitute kicked out by a bunch of old biddies. You have the alcoholic Dr. Boone. You have a shady whiskey salesman. You have a lot of very, very interesting folks, including a former Confederate soldier, a woman who's pregnant, all kinds of these very peculiar people. Boarding a stagecoach, traveling through dangerous territory, through Apache territory, on their way to New Mexico. Now, as that description would imply, yes, much of this movie was filmed in Monument Valley on the Utah-Arizona border. And so they're passing through dangerous territory to reach their destination. Along the way, a U.S. Marshal or rather, a member of the cavalry is with them, keeping an eye out for the fugitive called the Frisco Kid. Played, of course, by John Wayne. Ringo Kid. Frisco Kid is a movie with Gene Wilder as a rabbi. Long story. The Ringo Kid is played by John Wayne. Ringo is a wanted man who's been on the run as he escaped prison. So it's a crazy cast of characters on this stagecoach traveling together. And that, to me, is where our connection to Star Wars comes in. The Millennium Falcon is a bit like a stagecoach. That at various times in its history, chronologically from Solo: A Star Wars Story to The Rise of Skywalker, has been the home, or at least the stagecoach, quote-unquote, to a wacky cast of characters, all with their own stories, their own agendas, and their own destinations they need to get to. That is really the core of Stagecoach, and that, to me, is definitely a connection with Star Wars. Whether intentional or not. Also, the Ringo Kid, played by John Wayne, your archetypal cowboy. Cowboys are very much in the tradition of the character that Han Solo is. Han Solo is the archetype of the gunslinger. The swashbuckling gunslinger. And I think the Ringo Kid definitely plays into that archetype in Stagecoach. And speaking of archetypes, Stagecoach has been described as very much a movie featuring archetypal characters. which is exactly what it is. To me, it's very much made up of characters that we are familiar with. We understand a lot of these people, who they are and what they are, and that they fit into conventions and tropes that we are familiar with. For instance, you've got the alcoholic doctor. That's an archetype who we've seen many times. You've got the prostitute with a heart of gold, who's, has a hard time finding getting any respect from people, who just dismiss her as she is. You've got a southern gentleman. You've got a cowboy on the run. You've got just many other characters that you're familiar with, including a rather disreputable banker who joins the adventure. So there's a lot there with the archetypes of the characters. Also, as has been pointed out by critics and commentators, Star Wars is a Western in many respects. Definitely going from things like the desert landscapes of Tatooine, which I think you could see some parallels between Monument Valley as seen in Stagecoach, and the various geographical features of Tatooine. The idea of the Star Wars Cantina being very much a Wild West saloon. And what would be a saloon without a good bar fight? I don't think there's any bar fights in Stagecoach. But nonetheless, it fits into that milieu, that genre. Now, what's very interesting is that Orson Welles, the great filmmaker, is always believed that Stagecoach was the perfect textbook of filmmaking. That in terms of its structure, in terms of its style, in terms of its characters and story, was the textbook example of how a movie should be made. I say that because in our modern lexicon, or in our modern understanding, Star Wars kind of fits into that box. This is the textbook of storytelling in film. So, there is another comparison we can draw. Stagecoach was nominated for several Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. It won Best Supporting Actor for Thomas Mitchell, who plays the alcoholic Duck Boone. And it won Best Score, and rightfully so, as it has a great musical score. Now, that was a big year for Thomas Mitchell, who, as I said, won Best Supporting Actor for his work on this film, as he was also in Gone with the Wind and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. What a year for him. And I'm not sure, but he was probably in several other films. So, definitely an actor who I'm very pleased that he won an Oscar for this. Because in my mind, it's an Oscar-worthy role. And that was quite a year for film. 1939 is often considered the greatest year in the history of American cinema, with some incredible classics, Stagecoach among them. Now, I could do an entire episode about how the Western film parallels or connects with Star Wars. But for the sake of this series, I thought I would use one of the greatest Westerns of all time, or certainly one of the most iconic, as a platform in which to discuss Star Wars and Westerns, but also just to discuss Stagecoach as one of the great American movies. It is a film that I would highly recommend if you've not seen it. John Ford was one of the masters of cinema. Not only was he a good director of big, bold westerns, but his understanding of character. I can't think of very many directors who understood character as John Ford did. And of course, this movie was the introduction of the screen legend that is John Wayne, one of the most iconic, if not the most iconic, figure in the history of cinema. At least in terms of actors. So, if you have not seen it, check out Stagecoach. It is worth the watch. And if you do, let me know what other parallels you see to that galaxy far, far away. My name is Brendan Marr. That noise you hear is my ventilator. And thank you for tuning in to Page Turners They Were Not, my Star Wars podcast. May the Force be with you.